A Goboto Night. At Goboto, the traders come off their schooners, and the planters drift in from far wild coasts, and one and all they assume shoes, white duck trousers, and various other appearances of civilization. At Goboto, mail is received, bills are paid, and newspapers, rarely more than 5 weeks old, are accessible. The little island, belted with coral reefs, affords safe anchorage, is the steamer port of call, and serves as a distributing point for the whole wide-scattered island group. Life at Goboto is heated, unhealthy, and lurid, and for its size asserts the distinction of more cases of acute alcoholism than any other spot in the world. Goboto, over in the Solomons, claims that it drinks between drinks. Goboto does not deny this. It merely states in passing that in the Goboton chronology, no such interval as between drinks is known. It also points out its import statistics, which show a far larger per capita consumption of spirituous liquors. Goboto explains this on the basis that Goboto does a larger business and has more visitors. Goboto retorts that its resident population is smaller and that its visitors are thirstier. And the discussion goes on interminably, principally because the disputants do not live long enough to settle it. Goboto is not large. The island is only a quarter-mile in diameter, and on it are situated an Admiralty coal shed, where a few tons of coal have lain untouched for 20 years, the barracks for a handful of native labourers, a big store and warehouse with sheet-iron roofs, and a cottage inhabited by the manager and his 2 clerks. They are the white population. An average of 1 man out of the 3 is always to be found down with fever. The job at Goboto is a hard one. It is the policy of the company to treat its patrons well, as invading companies have found out, and it is the task of the manager and clerks to do the treating. Throughout the year, traders and recruiters arrive from far, dry cruises, and planters from equally distant and dry shores, bringing with them magnificent thirsts. Goboto is the mecca of sprees, and when they have spreed, they go back to their schooners and plantations to recuperate. Some of the less hardy require as much as 6 months between visits, but for the manager and his assistants there are no such intervals. They are on the spot, and week by week, blown in by monsoon or southeast trade, the schooners come to anchor, cargoed with copra, ivory nuts, pearl shell, hawksbill turtle, and thirst. It is a very hard job at Goboto. That is why the pay is twice that on other stations, and that is why the company selects only courageous and intrepid men for this particular station. They last no more than a year or so, when the wreckage of them is shipped back to Australia, or the remains of them are buried in the sand across on the windward side of the islet. Johnny Bassett, almost the legendary hero of Goboto, broke all records. He was a remittance man with a remarkable constitution, and he lasted 7 years. His dying request was duly observed by his clerks, who pickled him in a cask of trade rum, paid for out of their own salaries, and shipped him back to his relatives in England. Nevertheless, at Goboto they tried to be gentlemen. For that matter, though something was wrong with them, they were gentlemen, and had been gentlemen. That was why the great unwritten rule of Goboto was that visitors should put on pants and shoes. Breechclouts, lava-lavas, and bare legs were not tolerated. When Captain Jensen, wildest of the blackbirders, though descended from old New York blue-blood stock, surged in, clad only in loincloth, undershirt, 2 belted revolvers, and a sheath knife, he was stopped at the beach. This was in the days of Johnny Bassett, ever a stickler in the matters of etiquette. Captain Jensen stood up in the stern sheets of his whaleboat and denied the existence of pants on his schooner. Also, he affirmed his intention of coming ashore. They of Goboto nursed him back to health from a bullet hole through the shoulder, and in addition handsomely begged his pardon, for no pants had they found on his schooner. And finally, on the first day he sat up, Johnny Bassett kindly but firmly assisted his guest into a pair of pants of his own. This was the great precedent. In all succeeding years it had never been violated. White men and pants were undivorceable. Only aborigines ran naked. Pants constituted caste. On this night things were, with one exception, in no wise different from any other night. 7 of them, with glimmering eyes and steady legs, had capped a day of Scotch with swizzle-sticked cocktails and sat down to dinner. Jacketed, trousered and shod they were Jerry McMurtry, the manager, Eddie Little and Jack Andrews, clerks, Captain Stapler, of the recruiting ketch Merry, Darby Shrilton, planter from Tito Ito, Peter G., a half-caste Chinese pearl buyer who ranged from Ceylon to the Tuamotus, and Alfred Deacon, a visitor who had stopped off from the last steamer. At first, wine was served by the native servants to those that drank it, though all quickly shifted back to Scotch and soda, pickling their food as they ate it, ere it entered their calcined, pickled stomachs. Over their coffee they heard the rumble of an anchor chain through a hawse hole, tokening the arrival of a vessel.
"It's David Grief,"
Peter G. remarked.
"How do you know?"
Deacon demanded truculently.
"You fellows seem to think a stranger will fall for anything. I've done sailing myself, and naming a craft when its sail is only a blur, or naming a man by the sound of his anchor, it's unadulterated poppycock."
Peter G., engaged in lighting a cigarette, did not answer.
"Some of the natives can do amazing things that way,"
McMurtry interposed tactfully. As for the others, this conduct of their young visitor jarred on the manager. From the moment of Peter G.'s arrival that afternoon, Deacon had showed a tendency to pick on him. He had disputed his statements and been generally rude.
"Maybe it's because Peter's got Chinese blood in him," had been Andrew's hypothesis. "Deacon's South African, and they're loony there about colour." "That's probably it," McMurtry had agreed. "We can't permit that sort of thing here, especially of a man like Peter G."
In this, the manager had been in no wise wrong. Peter G. was better educated than any man there, spoke better English as well as several other tongues, and knew and lived more of their own ideals of gentility than they did themselves. And finally, he was a gentle soul. Violence he deprecated, though he had killed men in his time. Turbulence he abhorred, avoiding it like the plague. Captain Stapler stepped in to assist McMurtry.
"I remember when I changed schooners and came into Altman, the natives knew it was me right off the bat. I wasn't expected either, much less in another craft. They told the trader it was me. He used glasses and still wouldn't believe them, but they knew. Told me afterward they could see it sticking out all over the schooner that I was running her."
Deacon ignored him and returned to the attack on the pearl buyer.
"How do you know from the sound of his anchor that it's whatever you called him?" he challenged.
"There are so many things that go to make up such a judgment,"
Peter G. answered.
"It's rather hard to explain. It would almost require a textbook."
"I thought so," Deacon sneered. "Explanation that doesn't explain is easy."
"Who's for bridge?"
Eddie Little, the second clerk, interrupted, looking up expectantly and starting to shuffle.
"You'll play, won't you, Peter?"
"If he does, he's a faker,"
Deacon cut back.
"I'm tired of all this poppycock. Mr. G can surprise us all by telling how he knows who that man was that just dropped anchor. After that, I'll play piquet."
"I'd prefer bridge," Peter answered. "It's something like this. By the sound it was a small craft, no square rigger. No whistle, no siren was blown. Again, a small craft. It anchored close in. Still again, a small craft, for steamers and big ship must drop hook outside the middle shoal. Now the entrance is tortuous. There is no recruiting nor trading captain around who dares run the passage after dark. Certainly no stranger would. There are two exceptions. The first was Margonville, but he was executed by the High Court at Fiji. Remains the other exception, David Grief. Night or day, in any weather, he runs the passage. This is well known to all. A possible factor, in case Grief was somewhere else, would be some young daredevil of a skipper. In this connection, in the first place, I don't know of any, nor does anybody else. In the second place, David Grief is in these waters, cruising on the Ganga, which is shortly scheduled to leave here for Karo Karo. I spoke to Grief on the Ganga in Sandfly Passage, day before yesterday. He was putting a trader ashore on a new station. He said he was going to call in at Babo, and then come on to Goboto. He has had ample time to get here. I have heard an anchor drop. Who else than David Grief can it be? Captain Donovan is skipper of the Ganga, and I know him too well to believe that he'd run into Goboto after dark, unless his owner was in charge. In a few minutes, David Grief will enter through that door and say, "In Goboto, they merely drink between drinks." I'll wager $250 he's the man that enters, and that his words will be, "In Goboto, they merely drink between drinks."
Deacon was for the moment crushed. The sullen blood rose darkly in his face.
"Well, he's answered you," McMurtry laughed genially, "and I'll back his bet myself a couple of bucks." "Bridge, who's going to take a hand?" Eddie Little cried impatiently. "Come on, Peter!"
"The rest of you play," Deacon said. "He and I are going to play piquet."
"I prefer bridge," Peter G. said mildly.
"Don't you play piquet?"
The pearl buyer nodded.
"Then come on. Maybe I can show I know more about that than I do about anchors."
"Now look here,"
McMurtry began.
"You can play bridge," Deacon cut him off. "We prefer piquet."
File tool.
Reluctantly, Peter G. was bullied into a game that he knew would be unpleasant.
"Only a rubber," he said as he cut for deal.
"For how much?"
Deacon asked. Peter G. shrugged his shoulders.
"As you please."
100 up? $25 a game?
Peter G. agreed.
With default double, of course. $50?
"All right,"
said Peter G. At another table, 4 of the others sat at bridge. Captain Stapler, no card player, looked on and replenished the long glasses of scotch that stood at each man's right hand. McMurtry, with poorly concealed apprehension, followed as well as he could what went on at the piquet table. All were shocked by the behaviour of the South African, and all were troubled by fear of some untoward act on his part. It was apparent that he was working up his animosity against the half-caste, and that the explosion might come at any time.
"I hope Peter loses,"
McMurtry said in an undertone.
Not if he has any luck," Andrews answered. "He's a wizard at piquet, I know by experience."
That Peter G. was lucky was obvious from the continual badgering by Deacon, who filled his glass frequently. He had lost the first game, and from his remarks was losing the second, when the door opened and David Grief entered.
"In Goboto they merely drink between drinks,"
he remarked casually to the assembled company, and gripped the manager's hand.
"Hello, Mac. My skipper's down in the whaleboat. He's got a silk shirt, a tie, and tennis shoes, all complete, but he wants you to send a pair of pants down. Mine are too small, but yours will fit him. Hello, Eddie. How's that Ngari Gari? Oh, you up, Jock?
The miracle has happened. No one down with fever, and no one remarkably drunk. He sighed. I suppose the night is young yet. Hello, Peter. You catch that big squall an hour after you left us? We had to let go the second anchor. While he was being introduced to Deacon, McMurtry dispatched a houseboy with pants, and when Captain Donovan came in, it was as a gentleman should, at least on Goboto. Deacon lost the second game, and an outburst heralded the fact. Peter G. devoted himself to lighting a cigarette and keeping quiet.
What? Quitting because you're ahead?
Deacon demanded. Grief raised his eyebrows questioningly to McMurtry, who frowned back his own disgust. "I've won the rubber," Peter G. explained.
But I'm still entitled to win some money on a third hand. It's my deal. Now come on.
Peter G. acquiesced, and a third game was on.
"Young punk, he needs a thrashing,"
McMurtry muttered to Grief.
"Come on, let's quit. I want to keep an eye on him. If he goes too far, I'll toss him out on the beach, whether it's company instructions or not."
"Who is he?" Grief queried.
"A leftover from last steamer. The company's orders are to treat him nice. He's looking to invest in a plantation. Has a $50,000 letter of credit with him. And he's also got an all-white South Africa on the brain. Thinks 'cause his skin is pure white and his father once was Attorney General in Pretoria, he can act like a louse. That's why he's picking on Peter, and you know Peter's the last man in the world to cause trouble. Damn the company. I didn't engage to wet-nurse infants with bank accounts. Come on, fill your glass, Grief. The man's contemptible."
Oh, maybe he's only young,
Grief suggested.
"He can't hold his liquor, that's clear,"
the manager declared his disgust and wrath.
"If he raises a hand to Peter, so help me, I'll give him a licking myself, the little overgrown punk."
The pearl buyer pulled the pegs out of the cribbage board on which he was scoring and sat back. He had won the third game. He glanced across to Eddie Little, saying, "I'm ready for bridge now."
I wouldn't be a quitter,
Deacon snarled.
"Oh, really? I'm tired of the game,"
Peter G. assured him with his habitual quietness.
"Come on," Deacon bullied. "One more. You can't take my money that way. I'm out $75, double or nothing."
McMurtry was about to interpose, but Grief restrained him with his eyes.
"Yeah, if it positively is the last, all right," said Peter G., gathering up the cards. "It's my deal, I believe. As I understand it, this one is for $75. Either you owe me $150 or we quit even?"
"That's it, friend. Either we break even, or I pay you $150. "Getting interesting, eh?"
Grief remarked, drawing up a chair. The other men stood or sat around the table, and Deacon played again in bad luck. That he was a good player was clear. The cards were merely running against him. That he could not take his ill luck with equanimity was equally clear. He was guilty of sharp, ugly curses, which he snapped and growled at the imperturbable half-caste. In the end, Peter G. counted out, while Deacon had not even made his 50 points. He glowered speechlessly at his opponent.
"Looks like a default," said Grief.
"Which is double,"
said Peter G.
No need telling me," Deacon snarled. "I've studied arithmetic. I owe you $225. Take it."
The way in which he flung the money on the table was an insult in itself, but Peter G. was even quieter, and flew no signals of resentment.
"You've got fool's luck, but you can't play cards, I can tell you that much," Deacon went on. "I could teach you cards."
The half-caste smiled and nodded acquiescence as he folded up the money.
"There's a little game called Casino. I wonder if you've ever heard of it. A child's game?"
I've seen it played, the half-caste murmured gently.
Maybe you think you can play it? Snapped Deacon.
Oh, no, not at the moment. I'm afraid I'm not up to it.
It's a jolly game, Casino,
Grief broke in pleasantly.
I like it very much.
Deacon ignored him.
I'll play you $50 a game, 31 points out,
was the challenge to Peter G.
And I'll show you how little you know about cards. Come on, where's a full deck?
No thanks, the half-caste answered.
They need a fourth here at bridge.
Yes,
Eddie Little begged eagerly.
Come on, Peter, let's get started.
Afraid of a little game like Casino, Deacon sneered. Maybe the stakes are too high. I'll play you for pennies if you say so.
The man's conduct was an affront to all of them. McMurtry could stand it no longer.
Now hold on, Deacon. He says he doesn't want to play. Let him alone.
Deacon turned raging upon his host, but before he could blurt out his abuse, Grief had stepped into the breach.
I'd like to play Casino with you, he said. And what do you know about it?
Oh, not much, but I'm willing to learn.
Well, I'm not teaching for pennies tonight.
Oh, that's all right, Grief answered. I'll play for almost any sum, within reason, of course. Deacon proceeded to dispose of this intruder with one stroke.
I'll play you $500 a game, if that won't upset you.
Grief beamed his delight. That'll be fine. Let's begin. Do you count sweeps? Deacon was taken aback. He had not expected a Gobotan trader to be anything but crushed by such a proposition. Do you count sweeps? Grief repeated. Andrews had brought him a new deck, and he was throwing away the joker.
Certainly not,
Deacon answered.
That's a sissy game.
I'm glad, Grief coincided. I don't like sissy games either.
You don't, eh? Well, then, I'll tell you what we'll do. We'll play for $2,500 a game.
Again, Deacon was taken aback.
I'm agreeable, Grief said, beginning to shuffle. Cards and spades guard first, of course, and then big and little Casino, and the aces in the bridge order of value. Is that right? You're a lot of comedians down here.
Deacon laughed, but his laughter was strained.
How do I know you've got the money?
Well, by the same token that I know you've got it.
Mac, how's my credit with the company? All you want, the manager answered. You personally guarantee that? Deacon demanded. I certainly do, McMurtry said. Depend upon it. The company will honour his note up to and past your letter of credit.
Low card deals, Grief said, placing the deck before Deacon on the table. The latter hesitated in the midst of the cut, and looked around with querulous misgiving at the faces of the others. The clerks and captains nodded.
You're old strangers to me, Deacon complained. How am I to know? Money on paper isn't always the real thing.
Then it was that Peter G., drawing a wallet from his pocket and borrowing a fountain pen from McMurtry, went into action.
I haven't started my buying yet, the half-caste explained, so the account is intact. I'll just endorse it over to you, Grief. It's for 75,000.
Deacon intercepted the letter of credit as it was being passed across the table. He read it slowly, then glanced up at McMurtry.
Is this okay? Yes, just the same as your own, and just as good. The company's paper is always good.
Deacon cut the cards, won the deal, and gave them a thorough shuffle. But luck was still against him, and he lost the game.
Another game, he said. We didn't say how many, and you can't quit with me a loser. I want action.
Grief shuffled and passed the cards for the cut.
File 3.
"Let's play for 5,000, Deacon said when he had lost the second game. And when the 5,000 had gone the way of the two $2,500 bets, he proposed to play for 10,000. "That's progression," McMurtry warned, and was rewarded by a glare from Deacon. But the manager was insistent. "You don't have to play progression, Grief, unless you're foolish." "Who's playing this game?" Deacon flamed at his host, and then to Grief. "I've lost 10,000 to you. Will you play for 10,000? Grief nodded, and the fourth game began. And Deacon won. The unfairness of such betting was obvious to all of them. Though he had lost 3 games out of 4, Deacon had lost no money. By the child's device of doubling his wager with each loss, he was bound, with the first game he won, no matter how long delayed, to be even again. He now evinced an unspoken desire to stop, but Grief passed the deck to be cut. "What?" Deacon cried. "You want more?" "I haven't had anything yet," Grief murmured whimsically as he began the deal. "Back to the usual 2,500, I suppose?" The shame of what he had done must have even tingled in Deacon, for he answered, "No, we'll play for 10,000. And say, 31 points is too long. Why not 21 points out, if it isn't too rapid for you?" "That will make a nice, quick little game," Grief agreed. The former method of play was repeated. Deacon lost 2 games, doubled the stake, and was even again. But Grief was patient, though the thing occurred several times in the next hour's play. Then happened what he was waiting for, a lengthening in the series of losing games for Deacon. The latter doubled to 20,000 and lost, doubled to 40,000 and lost, and then proposed to double to 80,000. Grief shook his head. You can't do that, you know. You've got only 50,000 credit with the company." You mean you won't give me action?" Deacon asked hoarsely. "You mean that with 40,000 of my money you're going to quit?" Grief smiled and shook his head. "It's robbery, plain robbery," Deacon went on. You take my money and you won't give me action." "No, you're wrong. I'm perfectly willing to give you whatever action you've got coming. You've got $10,000 worth of action yet." "Well, we'll play it." Deacon took him up. "You cut." The game was played in silence, save for irritable remarks and curses from Deacon. Silently, the onlookers filled and sipped their long Scotch glasses. Grief took no notice of his opponent's outbursts, but concentrated on the game. He was really playing cards, and there were 52 in the deck to keep track of, and of which he did keep track. 2/3 of the way through the last deal, he threw down his hand. "Cards. Put me out," he said. "I have 27. "If you've made a mistake," Deacon threatened, his face white and drawn, "then I shall have lost. Count them." Grief passed over his stack of cards, and Deacon, with trembling fingers, verified the count. He half-shoved his chair back from the table and emptied his glass. He looked about him at unsympathetic faces. "I fancy I'll be catching the next steamer for Sydney," he said, and for the first time his speech was quiet and without bluster. As Grief told them afterward, "Had he whined or raised a roar, I wouldn't have given him that last chance. As it was, he took his medicine like a man, and I had to do it." Deacon glanced at his watch, simulated a weary yawn, and started to rise. "Wait," Grief said. "Do you want further action?" The other sank down in his chair, strove to speak, but could not, licked his dry lips, and nodded his head. "Captain Donovan here sails at daylight in the Gunga for Karo Karo," Grief began with seeming irrelevance. Karo Karo is a ring of sand in the sea with a few thousand coconut trees. Pandanus grows there, but they can't grow sweet potatoes nor taro. There are about 800 natives, a king and 2 prime ministers. It's a god-forsaken little hole, and once a year I send a schooner up from Goboto. The drinking water is brackish, but old Tom Butler has survived on it for 12 years. He's the only white man there. There are no missionaries. 2 native Samoan teachers were clubbed to death on the beach when they landed several years ago. Naturally, you're wondering what this is all about. But have patience. As I've said, Captain Donovan sails on the annual trip to Karo Karo at daylight tomorrow. Tom Butler is old and getting quite helpless. I've tried to retire him to Australia, but he says he wants to remain and die on Karo Karo, and he will in the next year or so. He's a queer old codger. Now the time is due for me to send someone else up to take the work off his hands. I wonder how you'd like the job. You'd have to stay for 2 years. Hold on, I'm not finished. You've talked frequently of action this evening. There's no action in betting away what you've never sweated for. The money you've lost to me was left you by your father or some other relative who did the sweating. But 2 years of work as a trader on Karo Karo would mean something. I'll bet the 50,000 I've won from you against 2 years of your time. If you win, the money's yours. If you lose, you take the job at Karo Karo and sail at daylight. Now that's what might be called real action. Will you play? Deacon could not speak. His throat lumped, and he nodded his head as he reached for the cards. One thing more, Grief said. I can do even better. If you lose, 2 years of your time are mine, naturally, without wages. Nevertheless, I'll pay you wages. If your work is satisfactory, if you observe all instructions and rules, I'll pay you $25,000 a year for 2 years. The money will be deposited with the company, to be paid to you with interest when the time expires. Is that all right? Too much so, Deacon stammered. You're unfair to yourself. A trader only gets $50 or $75 a month. Yeah, put it down to action, then, Grief said, with an air of dismissal. And before we begin, I'll jot down several of the rules. These you will repeat aloud every morning during the 2 years, if you lose. They're for the good of your soul. When you have repeated them aloud 730 Karo Karo mornings, I am confident they will be in your memory to stay. Lend me a pen, Mac. Now, let's see. He wrote steadily and rapidly for some minutes, then proceeded to read the matter aloud. I must always remember that one man is as good as another, even when he thinks he is better. Item 2. No matter how drunk I get, I must not fail to be a gentleman. A gentleman is a man who is gentle. Note, it would be better not to get drunk. Item 3. When I play a man's game with men, I must play like a man. Item 4. A good curse, rightly used and rarely, is an efficient thing. Too many curses spoil the cursing. Note, a curse cannot change a card sequence nor cause the wind to blow. Item 5. There is no license for a man to be less than a man. $50,000 cannot purchase such a license. At the beginning of the reading, Deacon's face had gone white with anger, then had risen from neck to forehead a slow and terrible flush that deepened to the end of the reading. There, that will be all, Grief said as he folded the paper and tossed it to the centre of the table.
Are you still ready to play the game? I deserve it, Deacon muttered brokenly. I've been a fool. Mr. G, before I know whether I win or lose, I want to apologise. Maybe it was the whiskey, I don't know, but I'm a damn fool.
He held out his hand, and the half-caste took it beamingly.
Grief, Peter G. blurted out. The boy's all right. Call the whole thing off, and let's forget it in a final nightcap.
Grief showed signs of debating, but Deacon cried,
No, I won't permit it. I'm not a quitter. If it's caro caro, it's caro caro. That's all there is to it.
Right, said Grief, as he began the shuffle.
If he's the right stuff to go to caro caro, caro caro won't do him any harm.
The game was close and hard. 3 times they divided the deck between them, and cards was not scored. At the beginning of the 5th and last deal, Deacon needed 3 points to go out, and Grief needed 4. Cards alone would put Deacon out, and he played for cards. He no longer muttered or cursed, and played his best game of the evening. Incidentally, he gathered in the 2 black aces and the ace of hearts.
I suppose you can name the 4 cards I hold,
he challenged, as the last of the deal was exhausted, and he picked up his hand. Grief nodded.
Then name them.
The Jack of Spades, the 2 of Spades, the 3 of Hearts, and the Ace of Diamonds, Grief answered. Those behind Deacon, and looking at his hand, made no sign. Yet the naming had been correct.
I fancy you play casino better than I, Deacon acknowledged. I can name only 3 of yours, a jack, an ace, and big casino.
Wrong. There aren't 5 aces in the deck. You've taken in 3, and you hold the 4th in your hand now.
Say you're right, Deacon admitted. I did scoop in 3. Anyway, I'll make cards on you. That's all I need.
I'll let you save, little casino. Grief paused to calculate. Yes, and the ace as well, and I'll still make cards and go out with big casino. Play.
Nobody makes cards, and I win,
Deacon exulted as the last of the hand was played.
I go out on little casino and the 4 aces. Big casino and spades only brings you to 20.
Grief shook his head. Some mistake, I'm afraid.
No, Deacon declared positively. I counted every card I took in. That's the one thing I was correct on. I've 26, and you've 26.
Count again, Grief said. Carefully and slowly, with trembling fingers, Deacon counted the cards he had taken. There were 25. He reached over to the corner of the table, took up the rules Grief had written, folded them, and put them in his pocket. Then he emptied his glass and stood up. Captain Donovan looked at his watch, yawned, and also rose.
Going aboard, Captain?
Deacon asked.
Yes, was the answer. What time shall I send the whaleboat for you? I'll go with you now. We'll pick up my luggage from the billy as we go by. I was sailing on her for Babo in the morning.
Deacon shook hands all around, after receiving final wishes of good luck on Caro Caro.
Does Tom Butler play cards?
He asked Grief. Solitaire, was the answer. Deacon turned toward the door, where Captain Donovan waited.
Then I'll teach him double solitaire,
he said with a sigh. The End.